that it's, okay. Okay, everyone good? Okay. So this session, what does it mean to love your near one as yourself? Perspectives from German Jewish history, has two parts, like my title. On Shavuot, Zman Matan Toratenu, the holiday of receiving the Torah, it's time to look at one pasuk, one mitzvah that has been called the central tenet, the fundamental principle of Torah. And that's the mitzvah to love our neighbor as ourselves. I've noticed that the words love thy neighbor have appeared on yard signs in our neighborhood. There's one on Lorna. And the one thing is interesting, though, is that they omit the end of the verse. Love thy neighbor, but not love thy neighbor as yourself. But still, that tells us something, that this is a useful and relevant verse. And it's useful and relevant in every generation. So one thing I'd like you to take away from this session is that this commandment in the Torah is both simple and enigmatic. It's simple and beautiful as a guiding principle for ethics, for religion. Maybe it encapsulates the absolute best of what religion and the Bible have to offer. But it's complicated. And when you try to put it into practice, okay, to figure out, as the rabbis do, what is exactly being asked of us here? We know that our practice as Jews is rabbinic, which means we need to know what's the tachlis. The Bible says to do something, right? Keep Shabbat. Well, are we supposed to light the candles? Are we supposed to have 2 chalot? Are we supposed to, what are we supposed to do? And if you heard, how many of you heard Ed's, talk here? It's the opposite of of the literalism that is nothing is perspicacious. And I want to argue that this verse is especially not perspicacious and clear, but it's enigmatic. And the evidence is really that every Jewish thinker, from Rabbi Akiva to Freud, and today Shai Held, has wrestled with this verse. So in the first part of the session, we're going to read through some of the classic interpretations. And I've written with each part about 4 or 5 different classic texts related to this verse. And after each one, I posed a question. We're not going to have time to really pause over each one, but after that section, we'll stop and have a little bit of questions or comments. And then the second part, I'm going to share with you a very rare commentary on this verse. And this is a feminist interpretation by a German Jewish woman, social activist, and writer named Bertha Pappenheim. Have any of you heard of Bertha Pappenheim? Okay, good. Well, if you go to the new Lair House restaurant in Somerville, you'll see a big picture of her on the wall. For some reason, the Lair House is championing Bertha Pappenheim. Now, on page 3 to 4, I have given you some of her comments about the verse of Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And these comments are unpublished. They're from her letters to Martin Buber. So she, in 1916, started a correspondence with Buber. They were both living in the vicinity of Frankfurt, and both teaching, and both activists, both writers, both German Jewish leaders, social activists, translators. And she wrote to him and started a correspondence, and they corresponded for 20 years. And these letters come at the very end of her life, where she writes to him about how she disagrees with his view of loving thy neighbor, and she has her own very strong opinions. And I can assure you that these comments are not being taught at any other tikkun. I saw these letters in the Buber archive in the National Library of Israel. But I strongly believe that she was an uneducated woman and kept saying, I'm a simple woman, I don't know much, but what I know is. that her voice and her interpretation of love thy neighbor as thyself should be heard among those voices of our sages on Shavuot. So starting with page 1. So here's the complete pasuk. You shall not take vengeance. You shall not bear any grudge against the children of your people. Love your fellow as yourself. I am the Lord. Okay. Leviticus 19:18. Lo tikom velo titor et bnei amecha, ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, ani Adonai. The mitzvah in Hebrew is 3 words. Ve'ahavta le, ve'ahavta, doesn't say ve'ahavta et, but ve'ahavta le reacha, you shall love or show love to. Reacha, your re'ah, your fellow human, your friend, the other. Kamocha, okay. We know the word kamocha, right, from mi kamocha, okay. Who is like you, right? That's who is like you, kamocha. Each word is a puzzle. Now, here are 4 recent English translations. And so an updated JPS says, love your fellow Israelite as yourself. I am Adonai. Everett Fox, but be loving to your neighbor as one like yourself. I am Yud He Vav He. You shall love your fellow Jew as yourself. I am Adonai. You shall love your fellow as yourself. I, Yud He Vav He, have spoken. And one thing you'll notice is that all these translators used brackets. Each one of them uses parentheses. And when translators do that, you know they're really stuck. I mean, that's not best practices for translation, but they wanted to clarify something in each case. And in 2 cases, they wanted to clarify that the fellow is a Jew. Okay. And that just tells you how unclear, they thought it is. It is. In one case, they clarified the second case. They want to clarify how to love your neighbor as one like yourself, which helps a little bit. Be loving to your neighbor, right? So they interpret kamocha as an modifying, not loving, not how you love, but your neighbor is like yourself. We'll come back to that later. That also clarifies things. You love your neighbor is like yourself. And the last one uses brackets to explain the ending of the verse, Ani Adonai, by saying, I, Adonai, have spoken, which is an interesting, does clarify something for us. Now let's go back to the context, because the verse isn't standalone. It appears in a verse about vengeance and grudges, okay? So now here, the rabbis were puzzled about that juxtaposition. Why is that verse why is V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha appear in a verse about don't take revenge and don't bear a grudge? So they tried to explain that by adding a mashal, a parable, a mashal, in between the 2 parts of the verse. So this is the way it looks in the Talmud. It is written, you shall not take vengeance, you shall not bear any grudge against the children of your people. What constitutes a parable for this? One was cutting something with a knife. and accidentally cut his own hand, would he then cut the hand that had been holding the knife in retaliation? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Rabbi Akiva says this is the central principle of the Torah. So what does this parable do? How does the parable solve, how does it bridge the two parts of the verse? Maybe someone, if it strikes you. I love this little parable about the knife. But because the function of the parable is to move you, it's to kind of bridge us to understanding something about loving your neighbor as yourself. Yeah, David.
Well, I think that it's trying to convey the idea that if you look at it in isolation, these two hands can be working at cross purposes with each other. But it's part of one body. Right. And because it's part of one body, it would be ridiculous for one to take vengeance on the other because it's all one body. And that ties back to the verse which says, don't bear a grudge against the children of your people. Right. Because it's almost as though we're all one people, we're all one body, which is, I think, why the translators wanted to insert Jew or Israelite. Mm-hmm. And excellent. So I think that's what the parable is trying to explain.
Yes. The parable says, don't take vengeance on someone because someone do something bad to you. Well, you're all one body. But are you really? But the parable makes you think that. It kind of persuades us that, it seems like, sure, but it is a story that is there, giving us that impression.
But this is also reinforced by I am the Lord.
Right, that's right.
Because I've commanded you as a people. I've given you these mitzvot as a people. So you're fulfilling my divine commandments.
Okay.
That makes you a body.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to let's go on to this is leading to what you just said, which is another kind of form of context, which is how often are we commanded to love? Where does that phrase ve'ahavta appear? And there's only two other people we're commanded to love with that word ve'ahavta, and I'm sorry that I took out the Hebrew verses here, but the first is the stranger. And these verses about loving the stranger come just 5 verses after ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, right there, okay, just a few verses later. And it's a whole different type of passage. When strangers reside with you in your land, you shall not wrong them. The word for strangers is ger, the ger. The strangers who reside with you shall be to you as your citizens. You shall love each one as yourself. Okay? Ve'ahavta lo kamocha. Ve'ahavta lo, there's that word kamocha again. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and again, I, Adonai, am your God. And the second instance are 2 verses in Deuteronomy, and one of them from the Shema, right, which is the most famous, right? Ve'ahavta, right? You shall love your God, Adonai, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And another verse in Deuteronomy, love your God Adonai and always keep, and also this is in chapter 11, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, V'shamarta mishmartav, chukotav. I'm sorry, I blanked, didn't get the Tanakh, the Hebrew. You shall love your God and keep God's charge, God's laws, God's rules, God's commandments. So those are the 3 verses. And, if we look at those 3 together, I ask, do these help us understand what ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha means? Does it help clarify whether the re'ah is specifically an Israelite? Or, as others have suggested, the commandment for loving the ger is so powerful, so explicated, so moving, so convincing. You were strangers, you love. I mean, it's just what we don't have in the previous verse. We have this amazing rationale that you know the spirit soul of the ger. That's, that appears many times. So given that, can we say that this is, as Herman Cohen will say eventually, this is about loving other human beings. This is not just loving an Israelite, loving the fact that we have love the re'ah, love the stranger, that this is about loving other all humans are included. I think it could go either way.
So what bothers me here is the quote from Leviticus 19:8. Et b'nei amecha.
Yeah.
In all the other cases, it goes out of the way to say to not include
Right.
it, and then it's included there.
Right.
So that refers to they insert the word Jew, Israelite,
Right.
but it seems like the object of the sentence is not
Right.
hafta, but it's
Yeah.
lo takom v'lo titor. You shouldn't take vengeance against Jews. Jews should not take vengeance against other Jews. And then full stop. Hafta l're'acha k'mocha ani Adonai. Kind of like it's translated by JPS
Yes.
1985 as different sentences. But not as a
Yes.
not as
It's a good case. You make a good case for understanding that re'ah is continuing the, same as b'nei amecha.
Yeah, I would, if we're gonna look at that, we also need to look at the larger context that right before that of the same
Yeah.
verses, Dochia,
Et
you
amitecha.
shall surely rebuke or confront your neighbor when
Yeah.
there's differences. And
Right.
But when you have differences, you don't do it you don't resolve it from vengeance, but you resolve it from a place of loving the other,
Right.
to lift each other up. But
So-
than
Okay, good. Okay, Tova.
It seems to me that in all three of these cases, it's not about an emotion of love, it's about how you act.
Yeah.
It's really the resulting.
Yes.
Doesn't the fact that there's a separate mitzvah for loving a stranger as yourself, like the Torah wouldn't waste space by including a redundant commandment. So there is a separate mitzvah for loving the stranger. That's the one found at verse 33. That implies that the one found at verse 18 has to not be the stranger.
Could
or else
be.
you have duplication.
Could be. Could be. Yeah.
I read this as, in part, as a political document,
It is a political document.
to be honest with you.
Yes, it is.
Because,
And legal,
because
right?
the way the interpretations you have when you quoted, and when you confront or discuss with other Jews, right wing or whatever, Orthodox, you can see when you bring these points up, how it can create a lot of discord.
Well, we're getting to the discord. You're absolutely right. It created a big problem. It created a big problem. But I'm going to move on, and we'll continue. We'll continue the conversation. So the last, on top of page 2, number 4, 2 rabbinic disputes. These are very famous uses of the verse. Very famous rabbinic passages where the verse plays an important role. And the first is we already heard Rabbi Akiva. Maybe you learned the song when you were growing up. Amar Rabbi Akiva. Didn't we learn that? Ve'ahavta l're'acha kamocha. Ze klal gadol b'Torah. Amar Rabbi Akiva. So, but Ben Azai challenged Rabbi Akiva and said, I'm going to paraphrase it, a better klal gadol is Genesis 5:1, human beings are created in the likeness of God. Okay. And why do you think that is a better foundation, let's say, for ethics, for treating others with love, being loving towards others? Why is that a better foundation, perhaps, than love your neighbor, love the other as you love yourself, or as yourself?
I think it's often used when you say that each of us is created in the image of God, that literally each of us has a divine spark.
Exactly.
And you may not treat yourself very well, you may not treat right, but like if you're literally looking at the other person as having some of the divine in them, every
Yes.
single other person,
Yes.
then there's even more of an imperative to treat
Yes.
them particularly well.
Good. Yeah, Amitai.
Well, if like if you're gonna, let's say, insult someone, or like if you're gonna insult someone, if you first think that they are image of God, they're in the image of God, you might because that's kind of like insulting God, or you might like look at them with more respect.
Yes. I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And the last kind of classical text is an instance between Hillel and Shammai. A Gentile comes to Shammai and says, "Convert me on condition that you teach me the whole Torah in 1 foot." Shammai pushed him away with a ruler or something and pushed him away. The same Gentile came to Hillel. He converted him and said, "You want to hear the whole Torah in 1 foot? That which is hateful to you, do not do to another." Okay? That's the whole Torah. The rest is interpretation. Go study. Okay. So, but Hillel does something very interesting. What's the difference, right? What is Hillel? How does he restate the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself? He restates it in the negative. Don't do to another what is hateful to you. If you wouldn't want someone to do that to you, don't do that to another person.
He's defining what love is.
He's making it the common denominator. He's going to the lowest level of.
Yes, he's going to the lowest level. Nechama Leibovitz explains very pragmatic, a very pragmatic interpretation. Yeah.
The halachic literature separates the two parts of the sentence. So lo tefon v'lo tetor relates to monetary damages in a civil manner. So you're limited to just damages. And the halachic brocha is a limitation on the ability to impose penalties in a criminal manner. So you would not impose a penalty unless you did likewise to all.
Okay. Just reminds me of the difference between vengeance and a grudge, which I think is also famous. That, vengeance is defined as, you didn't lend me your axe, I won't lend you my axe. Okay, that's revenge. But bearing a grudge is, you didn't lend me your axe, but I will lend you mine, even though you didn't lend me yours. And both are bad. Okay. Oops, sorry about that. Okay. Now, part 2. 2 German Jewish philosophers and a social worker debate this verse in 1935. Now, keep in mind, we're in Germany in 1935. Right? These are the Nazi years, restricting of Jewish rights, in rapid-fire succession, burning books and worse. 1935. It's not really a debate, but what happens is that Martin Buber and his wife come to visit Bertha Pappenheim. I know this from the letters. And they discuss the command of loving thy neighbor. And after that, Buber sends her a little book, and I have the book here. that Buber had just published in 1935, what's Buber doing? Teaching, publishing, teaching, writing, teaching. The Nazis are in power. We have to keep teaching. We have to keep teaching. We have to reinforce our Judaism. And Bertha was of the same view. We're not giving up. We're not leaving. We're going to teach, be Jews, strengthen our Jewish identity, spiritual resistance. So they're publishing tons of these little, these little books in Shakin, with different sources, different thinkers, So massive cultural activity. So Buber sends Pappenheim the book, which is by a German Jewish philosopher, Hermann Cohen. And Cohen had written many essays about the topic of loving the neighbor in the 19th century. And in brief, he wrote them to respond to anti-Semitism. Why? Well, we know that in the 1880s was the beginning of kind of the massive of racial anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism returns with a vengeance in the late 19th century. And Cohen wrote many essays about this commandment of loving the neighbor in response to anti-Semitic biblical criticism and Christian anti-Semitism. Why does he do that? And this gets to the politics that you were mentioning. And you need to know something about what happened in how this verse is read in German translation. That in German, loving thy neighbor is called Nächstenliebe. It's a nice capsule word, which means love of the nearest. Okay. Love of the nearest, Nächst. Nächste is superlative, not the near one or the neighbor, but the nearest one. Okay, exactly. And these are my neighbors here. Right, so now who made that translation? Echo back to Ed, what Ed said here. Luther. Luther translated the verse, right? Du sollst deinen Nächsten lieben wie dich selbst, okay? So love the nearest one to you. He translated Re'ah, right, as the nearest one. And that stuck. Every German, Jewish, non-Jewish, German understood this verse very clearly as referring to Jews. But why does this, what does the kind of the anti-Semitic strain do with that? They say, this is supersessionism, Jews love only other Jews, but Christianity, teaches universal love. So, Jesus, and if you go and Google love thy neighbor, the first several things that will come up are Christian. So Jesus quoted this, in Mark, in Matthew, and Luke. So this becomes co-opted by, by the New Testament. And it's thought that Jews, Jews only love Jews, but Christianity teaches loving of human beings. Now, I want to skip over now to Bertha Pappenheim. So Bertha Pappenheim, just a little bit down on page 3. And I want to just read how she responded, because it just gives a very different perspective. She gets Cohen's book, and she writes these letters in 1935 and 1936. She says, "Thank you for the book, which I will try to read with the appropriate timidness. Perhaps I will come nearer to your rather patriarchal, easygoing idea of kamocha." Okay. So she's saying that Buber's idea of loving thy neighbor is too easygoing and too patriarchal. Okay. Why does she say that? If you look above, we see a little bit of what Martin Buber said about who the Re'ah is. And Buber, writes I and thou. And Buber believes in dialogue, and he's a philosopher of dialogue and of interpersonal encounter. And he, is an expert on, on these topics of self and other, right? That's his thing. And she says, and he says, the Re'ah is the person I am engaged with now, the person I encounter now in any moment, regardless of who they are, any human being, okay? I know the soul of that person. I need to show them love because they are human beings like me, right? This is about as good as we'll get, right, I think, of a definition of what we think of when we think of Ahavta l'reacha kamocha, right? It's the stranger you meet on the street. It's the person you encounter in your life, whoever that is. So why does Bertha Pappenheim accuse him of being, this is too easygoing. This is too easygoing and patriarchal. So first about the patriarchal. She says, to an observing stranger, and she's quoting, the word for ger. She's basically saying, Mark Buber, you're like, to you as a ger, in my life. It might seem odd that the man preaches leniency, a woman demands severity, but it is very simple. A woman's love is far more expansive. She is supposed to be the creator or the shaper of life through hurt and pain. She brings forth the Re'ah, taking hold of them to shape them with unfailing love. She has to guide, exhort, to develop the divine embryo. Difficult, strenuous work, destiny. So, Pappenheim uses maternity, motherhood, parenthood, okay? She herself was not married and was never a mother, but she uses maternity, parenthood, as a paradigm for loving the neighbor. Loving the neighbor doesn't just mean you're nice to the person you see on the street or whoever comes in your way, comes in your path. You need to shape that other person. You need to educate them. You need to guide them the way a parent guides the children. And then she was very dogmatic, and she, says, you men don't understand that, okay? In the next passage, she says, men speak, women act. Women have two hands. One is lenient, one is firm. Women understand this. And then she also introduces, she accused Buber, you're not demanding enough. This is too easy. This is too lenient. She says, love and hate go together. And she says, I love the highest and the nearest, just as I hate their opponents and enemies, every day, every hour. I would like to make this love and this hate accessible to all, to implant it. That is neighbor love, an educational goal. The methods of that education are many. Love and hate go hand in hand, okay? Then she says something which is very moving. She says, and this is really the essence of her critique, and it gets to an interesting tension. You're probably going to make fun of my ideas, but I will not allow something so simple, so true, so heartwarming to become complicated. And she's saying essentially, you don't need to be a philosopher or to understand the simplicity, the pashat re'ah, that it's a simple mitzvah. And she says, I have never had a near one, right? Maybe it's simple to me because I'm alone. And I have never had a near one to complicate my existence. And then in the next passage, she movingly says that thank you so much for your letters. I am your near one. I am your nechste. I am, thank you for, you are guiding me, you are teaching me. And in the next passage, she gets to the heart of the matter, which is she interprets love thy neighbor as help thy neighbor, right? And this is why she thinks that women understand. So women who never studied, who were never taught, who never learned Talmud, who were excluded from intellectual life, this is what she writes in her other writings. Nonetheless, women lived the tradition. They knew, they lived Judaism, they lived these values, and she says, naturally, I will help anyone who needs help. That doesn't mean I love him. So I could hate someone, despise someone, and still help them, but not love them. Love is individual, right? So her interpretation of the mitzvah is really about the commandment to help others, regardless of how one feels about them. And, and she reiterates that also very movingly in the last passage, and this is right before she dies. She's in her 70s and Buber's in his 50s. And she says to the children, to my children who I'm teaching, I explain the mitzvah of love thy neighbor the way you explain it to me, but it is more. It is also the hatred of that which is not worthy of love, period. So the only thing that we didn't talk about are, kind of the points that Hermann Cohen makes, but let's stop for any thoughts or questions. Yeah.
I love this. And the reason is that although her expression of this is guttural and visceral, it also is incredibly philosophical. The reason I say that is that Maimonides, following Aristotle, says on Pirkei Avot, that there are three kinds of friendship, right? The first kind of friendship is the chavruta. You do philosophy together. Aristotle said it's the Roman senators, your colleagues in the Roman Senate. Only they could have the highest philosophical relationship. And then the second level of friendship is people you love, your near ones. And the third level of friendship is a beneficial, more transactional relationship, not in the Trumpian sense of transactional, but in the sense of being open to one another.
Yes.
And willing to have some kind of relationship.
Yeah.
They're really three fundamentally different kinds of things. And so her analysis, which is so guttural, is also deeply philosophical.
Yes, and and I think it's evident that I'm trying to make a case about her. I mean, I wouldn't call her a Jewish thinker, but she has, maybe we can call her a Jewish thinker, but that's something I'm trying to figure out. But I agree. I really, really agree. It is philosophical. Yeah.
I think it's interesting you provide her dates here, and she's
Yeah.
75 years old
Yeah.
of this writing, and she was to pass away a year later,
Yeah.
in 1936.
Yeah.
So I'm just sort of, whereas Buber was about 60 at the time
Right.
of this writing,
Right.
so, and had 30 more years to live.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
maybe that somehow influences the way they were thinking about it, and you're making me curious as to if Buber was such a, let's stay to teach, how did he even survive the next 10 years?
He left in 38. He eventually left when he was, forced to, and went to Israel and had a whole other, career, another 30 years almost of career of doing what he did, teaching, right, in Israel. But the sad thing about her dying, when she did, is that her letters to Buber survived because he saved every, single letter, whereas, and there's like millions of them whereas his letters to her were burned and lost. Much of her papers were lost in the war and were burned. And so it's a one-sided correspondence of about 50 letters between the two of them. But he admired her very much. I mean, they had a lot of collaborations. I'm trying to piece it together. But I think she brought something out in him. he brought something out in her, is what I meant. Did you want to raise your hand? Oh. Yeah, whether she brought something out in him, we don't know so well. We don't hear his, we don't hear his side of it. But anyways, I think that I think that what I like about this collection is just the tensions that you can think about when you look at that pasuk, when you think about that mitzvah. Is it, a simple guiding principle that's just put at the end of that verse, right? Or is it related to that verse? Or is it simply more like a proverb, just a guiding principle for life? Is it something that's, easygoing? Is it something that demands severity? Is it, how do we respond to the kind of Christian, the Christian kind of, co-opting or appropriating of it? And also in the very end with Bertha, how does, she's being very honest about the fact that her personal life experience, right? She works with children. She works with unmarried women. She works with white slave. She's a social worker, right? But she says, I never had a near one, right? So how does our own personal, life experience, interpersonally shape, what we think, how we interpret that verse? And she's so honest about that, and it's very moving. So anyways, thank you very much. Chag Sameach.